Hi, I just wanted to say that I'm so grateful for everyone who supported my previous video on Mary's perpetual virginity. On the whole, I was really touched by the amazing responses I had, so thank you. Today, I wanted to discuss another topic that I've often wondered about, especially over the course of the past year as my devotion to St. Joseph has been increasing. We know from historical records, as well as our knowledge of the customs of the time, that Mary was probably between the age of 14 and 16. But how old actually was the adoptive father of Jesus? This is a topic I already know a little bit about, and from what I can tell, it's incredibly difficult to identify a single age range which St. Joseph could have been within at any given point in the Gospels. In other words, we have no flipping clue. But there are a few things we can take into account to make some educated guesses. So, just a disclaimer, everything in this video is just that, an educated guess. He is only mentioned a handful of times in the Gospels and is never recorded speaking a single word. A very important point that I could make an entirely separate video on in the future. But the information which we get on him isn't a lot to go on. We know he was an upright and righteous man, we know he was a carpenter, and we know he was the husband of Mary. And that's about it. Everything else we can say about him is just guessing in the dark. Personally, though, I like to think of St. Joseph as a young man. One of the strongest pieces of evidence I think we have for this is that his life was very physical. He worked as a carpenter, first of all. I'm 18 years old, in the prime of my life, and I don't think I could deal with the physical demands of carpentry, so I'm kinda hesitant to say that St. Joseph would have been an old man. Additionally, we know that he did a lot of walking, like an insane amount of walking. He would have made the nearly 300-kilometre round trip to Jerusalem 3 times a year to celebrate the Jewish feasts. He walked nearly 150 kilometres to Bethlehem with Mary when she was pregnant. Then he fled to Egypt, which is another 300 kilometres from Bethlehem, just to reach the border. And we don't know what part of Egypt they travelled to, but it's likely that it took them well over 1,000 kilometres from their hometown of Nazareth. And don't forget, they walked back as well. This kind of walking is no joke. The distance alone is just insane, but throw in the difficult terrain and dangerous company they would have met along the way, and I'm sorry, but if St. Joseph had been an old man, they wouldn't have lasted a day. I mean, when I did my Duke of Edinburgh, we walked around 40 kilometres. It took us 4 days and I was exhausted. That's a fraction of the distance St. Joseph would have walked, and I didn't have to worry about a pregnant woman or a newborn child at any point on my journey. Plus, I live in Scotland. I did not have to deal with the stifling heat that St. Joseph would have suffered, although admittedly I probably got more rain. I would guess he was probably between the age of 17 and 20, which means he would have been no older than 50 at the very maximum when he died, since we know Jesus was somewhere between 12 and 30 years old when St. Joseph died. However, he could have been as young as 30, but that wasn't so uncommon for the time. But then we also have the Proto-Evangelium of James to consider. It was written around 145 AD, and in it, St. Joseph says, "I have children and I am an old man." However, this isn't an approved writing, so I suppose we have to take some of the things it says with a grain of salt. I've heard before, I couldn't tell you where, but I have heard that some of the early church fathers aged St. Joseph up to protect the idea of Jesus' virginal conception, because of course, if he had been a dashing young man, people would have been far less likely to accept that he and Mary never had sex. So maybe that's what's going on here, and then maybe that's why this writing remains unapproved, and maybe that's why it wasn't included in the Bible? I don't know. I literally have zero evidence to back this up. I'm just thinking aloud more than anything else. I can't explain why they would say he had children, though. And of course, if he really did have children and was a widower open to marrying Mary, then there's no way he could have been a mere teenager. The Church, as far as I'm aware, has not declared any official teaching on this subject, so I think it really is open to interpretation, and you should imagine St. Joseph at whatever age allows you to connect with him best as a spiritual father. Regardless of how old he was, we know that St. Joseph was a very holy man, an example to all of us, and we have a lot to learn from him. The life he led Mary and Jesus through would have been by no means easy, and he would have had to work incredibly hard, selflessly and tirelessly just to keep food on the table. Because in Egypt they would have been outcasts, and in Israel they would have been under the strain of increasingly heavy taxes from the Romans. His work in the carpenter's shop alone would have been exhausting, never mind all the walking he would have had to do to sell what he made, to show Jesus how to work the wood so that he would have had a bright future, to look after Mary and Jesus when they were sick or tired or injured. I could go on. He truly was a man of God who we can model our lives after. And I truly believe that if we follow the example of St. Joseph, the world will be full of many more holy people.